welcome to one of the first episodes of STtalks. I'm Laura Demmer, your host today, and I'm here with Mitch Hockett, the U.S. Tech Service Manager. Mitch is presenting at the Dairy Cattle Reproduction Council's annual meeting this week on a topic which impacts every dairy producer, and that is optimizing each pregnancy on the dairy while also enhancing reproductive performance. So first off, Mitch, can you tell us how these two very important topics go hand in hand for every dairy farm, no matter what the size?
Sure. Thanks, Laura. Reality is that on dairies, we have to constantly be thinking about expenses on the dairy and minimizing those, but also thinking about some of those expenses as investments. And when we think through the costs associated with their reproductive programs, they really don't add up to much of the expenses of a dairy. Usually only around 1% is tied to genetics, but that expense ties directly into our milk production for future generations, fat and protein, the productive life of the animal, as well as reproductive efficiency. So that small amount of investment early on can have huge payback long term. And when we talk about optimizing the value of every pregnancy, I like to think that every cow uterus is basically a resource on the farm. And so if we use those to maximize the net potential to the farm, then we're going to identify the ones that belong to animals that are elite or the highest genetic level in the herd and use those for their best purpose, which would be in heifer creation for replacements. And then those that are of lower genetic merit, we really want to maximize the value of the calves that they carry as well. And we can do that by using beef semen in many cases, as we've learned that those beef cross calves have a higher market value than a straight purebred dairy calf would, bull calf. So by combining that approach, which we often hear in the industry as a sexed and beef model, using sex-sorted semen to create heifers from elite animals, using beef semen on the lower end of the herd, we end up with the highest value pregnancies in all those animals. And then we talk about using those tools to optimize performance. And when I think about that, I think about the reproductive strategies that we're taking. If it's a synchronization protocol, are we giving every injection to protocol? Are we adhering to protocols to maximize the percentage of the animals that are actually ovulating at the time of insemination with timed AI? As well, we've learned that sex-sorted semen has different ideal timing for insemination than conventional. So making sure that we're using the tools that are in our toolbox the way they're intended to get the best results is really important.
That was a great explanation on that type of protocol that a lot of dairies, I feel like, are participating in now. So in today's world, deciding what to breed for has a lot of options. So some people select for traits, gender, breed, parentage, and more. What do you think is the right path to a more profitable and successful herd when selecting what to breed for?
That's a really good question. I think our dairies across the country are all incentivized in different ways, with the bulk receiving some sort of incentive for components, fat and protein. I feel like that will always be selection intensity should be focused on components, pounds of solids that we're shipping down the road per cow. So total pounds of fat, total pounds of protein will be important. I think that the percentage of those components is important because the higher that percentage, the fewer pounds of fluid milk required to achieve the same number of pounds of solids, so we can ship less water down the road. So emphasis on component percents is important. And over time, what we've seen in the last decade especially is that we can make good genetic progress on some lowly heritable traits if we keep intensely selecting for those. And we think about the health traits when we have that conversation. Those that are tied to culling and longevity of the animal are extremely important. And sustainability is a buzzword in the industry, and it's only going to become more of a buzzword when we think about how we can use less resources to produce more. And a big part of that is on how efficiently the animal converts what it eats into protein that it's producing. So I think about feed efficiency as a major selection criteria in sires that we look for. We should look for those that have offspring that efficiently utilize the nutrients that they take in, and still have the ability to produce in large volume. Then we want animals that are culled from the herd at a low rate early in life. So we can easily select for productive life as a trait that is correlated to many other things. It could be tied to the fertility of that animal, as well as, let's say, lameness. All the things that could go into having that animal be culled early lead to lower productive life. So if we select for longer productive life, we are making genetic progress on many traits at once, but the long-term value to the dairy is that we have animals that we've spent a lot of money raising to get them into production, but they end up in the herd for longer periods of time so that we can recoup that investment and have a chance for more net profit.
So those are all great traits dairy producers can select for when it comes to a sex semen model. But prior, you had said that the beef on dairy model is very popular. Are there any certain traits dairy producers should be selecting for when it comes to the beef semen on their lower genetic pool?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. And we are traditionally always thinking about what makes us the most efficient, cost efficient, but also productively efficient on the dairy side. But as those calves are going to enter the beef chain, we have to be aware of what brings value in the beef industry. Again, we're going to be interested in things that lead to efficiency. So efficiency of production or gain is going to be important. How efficiently those calves can take in feed and digest that and transition that into growth or pounds of muscle is going to be important to them. So we do look at feed efficiency. Rate of gain is important. And then, because what is going to be marketed at the end of the day is carcass, we need to look at what's of value in the pack to the packer and the retailer. And those are going to be tied to the yield of a carcass and the quality or quality grading of the carcass. If it's going to have the potential to grade out choice or prime, that will have more in value to the retailer and the packer. And so those are desirable. And in order to help people make better selection decisions, there are some indices that have been developed. The Angus Association has developed the Angus on Holstein and Angus on Jersey indices that can be used to help guide producers in those selections. But in general, we certainly want to select for the right carcass traits. Ribeye area is an indicator of muscle. Marbling is an indicator of quality grade. And then the last thing I would say is we have to pay attention to calving ease. So some of the beef breeds mated on to a dairy cow could lead to a large calf. And much like in dairy, we have some sires that are known for calving ease and some that are known for difficult births. And that can be true in beef breeds as well. So we do pay attention between breeds in that calving ease, but even within breed, we look for sires that are going to have adequate size, because when calf buyers buy these beef cross calves, they do want a certain pounds of birth weight. And if they are below that, they may dock the price that they're willing to pay. So we don't want calves born too small, but at the same time, we can't have them born too large either. So it's really about keeping an adequate size without getting them too large at birth. And those combined kind of make up primary selection criteria that we see on the beef side.
I think that's really important information. A lot of times when selecting that beef semen, maybe it's not always prioritized as heavily as when they're selecting their sex semen. So that was a lot of great information, Mitch. Have you seen, or could you give us an example of a dairy that uses this sex semen on their higher genetic pool in their herd with the beef on the lower end? Can you give us a model or an example where this has provided profits to a dairy?
Sure. I guess maybe the best way to walk through that, rather than a specific example, is just talking how dairies that, because many dairies have gone down this path, and it's become kind of the standard of large herds. And I believe that we can walk through the value proposition pretty easily. When you're looking at the possibility of using sex sorted semen and beef semen on a portion of the herd, really the two driving factors to the profit that is produced there is the conception rate of the semen that's used, and I guess the cost of that semen essentially, and then the value of the crossbred calf versus the male counterpart, the male dairy calf. So when we talk about Holstein herds, the delta or the difference, price differential between a Holstein bull calf and the beef dairy cross calf is typically around $100 to $150 in current prices. And so it really doesn't take much for us to understand that that leads to a huge profit earning potential. And I've often walked through an example of a herd that needs to create about 500 replacements annually. And we could say maybe that's a 1,500 cow herd. They need 500 replacements annually, and they could do that a couple different ways. They could use conventional semen across the herd to generate those, or they could target the high end of the herd genetically with sex sorted semen, and that's going to come at a cost. Sex sorted semen is more pricey than conventional, but you need fewer doses of that sex sorted semen to achieve the same number of heifers. And so what we end up with is a smaller percentage of the herd bred to dairy semen, which expands the opportunity to create beef cross calves on a much larger portion of the herd. And when each of those calves are born with an extra $100 to $150 of value, in that example, we end up with, after we apply the cost of the beef semen, we still end up with about $30,000 additional net profit after all expenses. So there's tremendous upside, and really this becomes a new cash source for the farm.
That was a great explanation, Mitch. So while we're on the subject of profits, with the markets we are currently facing, every dairy producer is looking at costs and where is there a place that they can cut down? Where do you think genetics plays a role in this decision, or do you think it plays a role at all?
Yeah, well, I have to admit that working in an AI organization, I may sound a little bit biased, but when you look at the expenses, in 2020, if you look at the expenses that USDA recorded or reported for dairies of 1,000 cows or more, veterinary costs, which include reproductive costs, only averaged a little over 3% of the expenses of the farm. And if you break out just the genetic portion of that, it really represents only about 1% of expenses of the dairy. So it's difficult for me to look at that 1% of the expense and think that that's a good target. And the reason I feel that way is, in my mind, this comes back to the discussion about are genetics and the costs associated with that portion of the reproductive program, are they an expense or are they an investment? If we think about them as an expense, then they're just a cost of doing business. There are costs of getting the cow pregnant so that she's back in production in the next year. And that has a lot of value to the farm, no doubt. But when we think about it as an investment, which I think we have to, we realize that there's a much bigger payout down the road. And that payout is in milk, fat, protein, the longevity of the animal, the feed efficiency of that animal. And when we invest in higher genetic merit sires, we're having a long-term impact on the farm, because it's not just that first generation that benefits. We can invest an extra $2 to $3 in a straw of semen, and the payback is really astronomical, because we're getting the value of those genetics in that first generation, the resulting calf. But then she is going to transmit that to the next generation. And so those genes that we're purchasing in that straw are flowing from one generation to the next. And we get a lift every generation thereafter on the maternal side. Traditionally, I think large dairies and many commercial farms have really considered that they'll invest some money on the sire side, but we have a chance with the Sexton beef model. We're also scrutinizing on the maternal side, which really ramps up the genetic progress of the farm much faster than it ever has been before. And I would say that if I were going to cut costs, the place where I would do it is not where there's the most potential return on investment in a bucketed item that is one of the smallest expenses on the farm.
Yes. Well, as our time is getting short here, Mitch, if there was one takeaway from the presentation that you are giving at the DCRC annual meeting this week, for those not able to attend, what would it be?
For me, I think that we have to constantly remind ourselves that we can't be stuck doing things the way we've always done them. And we have tools in our toolbox, but sometimes we learn that there's a newer version of that tool that leads to a better outcome. And in this case, I think the AI industry has been great at delivering advanced genetics for many decades. But now we have, with the advent of sex-sorted semen and improvements in that product, and now learning how to better use it so that we're not overcreating heifers, but really calculating the number we need and strategically targeting where those are coming from the top end genetically of the herd, and then opening up the value proposition of beef calves and the value that they bring to the beef industry, then I think that we have to be open to new programs that do things in a better way financially for the farm. And that would be the take-home message.
Which I think really reflects ST Genetics' tagline, the best way to predict the future is to create it. So with that, thank you, Mitch, for your time. This was another episode of ST Talks. You can find this episode and more soon on your favorite podcast platform.